All right, so just to kind of recap Tuesday for you guys, since y'all wasn't here, again, you should have this stuff. But we talked about the roles, different roles of the presidency, and there's about 8 of them. If you scroll down through these notes, they kind of put them in order, and then they go into detail about each one of them. But basically, it's what we call the president when he's fulfilling different roles with his job description, like the chief of state, chief executive, chief administrator, the chief diplomat, the commander-in-chief, legislator, chief of party, and citizen. So we kind of went through what each of those meant, okay? So just to give you the Cliff Notes version of those, and then we'll move on to section 2. At the bottom of that paper, the handout that you should have got, did everybody get it filled out? The 7 through the 14? If you didn't, tell me, because you're going to need these later. You're going to see a quiz on this that looks very similar. I just want to make sure we got it. But if you start with the chief of state, the president serves as the chief of state. The thing it gives you, it says is the ceremonial head of government. What it means by that, guys, and I'll just scroll down here to where it starts it. He's basically the symbol of the American people. When things are good, bad, or in between, the American people usually look to the government in order to find answers. Does that make sense? So being the symbol of the American people, he's the person that's looked at through American society to kind of steer us in the directions that we need to go. Okay? Obviously, he can't do that by himself, but he is the one looked at to try to do those things. Okay? Second one there, the chief executive. I hope that one's pretty common sense. He's in the executive branch, so he would be the leader of the executive branch. So he holds the nation's executive power. Now, the next part of that where it says domestic and foreign affairs, I'm not going to get into that yet. We'll talk about that when we get to where he's a diplomat. But where he's holding the nation's executive power, that means he has the ability to carry out laws. He's the only person that can sign a bill into law, so he's one of the few that has the ability to carry it out. And obviously the FBI, CIA, all that's part of that as well. But he is the one that actually puts them into practice, okay? The third one there, the chief administrator. Your notes there say he's director of more than 22.7 million civilian employees of the executive branch. So basically, at his directive, those people do what he needs them to do. Now, obviously, he's not the boss of 2.7 million people. There's people that works their way up through and takes over certain groups. But he is the boss of the executive branch, okay? Fourthly, you had the chief diplomat. He's the main architect of foreign policy. Guys, when you think of chief diplomat and the president, think foreign policy. When people come here from other countries, they're not coming here to, from a political standpoint, they're not coming here to speak to anybody but to the president, okay? So he is the architect of the foreign policy. Commander-in-chief, that was pretty self-explanatory. That's when he controls the military forces. He can basically send them where he wants to, when he wants to. Now, he can't go into any type of wartime affairs unless Congress approves it. But once Congress approves it, the president is in control. Now, he's got generals and things of that nature that work to lead the military, but he is the one that makes the final decision on certain things. Okay? The next one here is the one that usually confuses people. It's talking about the chief legislator. The president is not per se in the legislative branch, okay? But the president does have the ability to propose laws. Now, just because he has the ability to propose a law, does that mean that Congress has to approve it? No, they don't have to approve it. Now, if the president really wants something done and Congress tells him no, does he have a way of getting it done? Does anybody know? Can he do something without Congress's approval when it comes to putting certain public policy into effect? Yes, it's called an executive order. So you kind of need to know the difference between an executive order and a law. A law is a law forever and ever. Does that make sense? It'll be there till the end of time. An executive order has the resemblance of a law, but it is only in effect while that president who made it is in office. The next person that comes in can remove it, and it's no longer held to a standard of law. You guys with me? A great example of that's Obamacare. When President Obama was in office, he wanted the Health Care Act, right? Congress didn't pass it, so he made it an executive order. When he left and President Trump became the president, he actually got rid of Obamacare. You see what I'm getting at? So that's because it was an executive order. If it would have been signed into law, there's nothing President Trump could have done. Okay? So he does have the power to suggest laws, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Congress has to approve. All right? And then the last two are pretty simple. The chief of party and the chief citizen. Him being the chief of the party means he is in control of his political party. Right now, the Republicans are in charge of the White House. So the president is the control of the Republican Party. And then lastly, the chief citizen. He's the one that represents all the people. So when other nations look at us, he is the one that they're looking at as a representation of our people. Okay? So those are the 8 roles. You will need to know those. Again, that whole lecture is online. So if you need it, it's there. You can have at it. Okay? Last thing I want to talk to you about Section 1, and then we'll move on to Section 2. We did jot down one thing that isn't on that paper. So if you don't have the 22nd Amendment written down, you need to make sure you do that now. Okay? Because you're going to need to know what the 22nd Amendment is. And I'll scroll to it. I think it's in here. Yeah. Right here's the 22nd Amendment. Okay? It was ratified in 1944. Now, once you know what the 22nd Amendment is, it'll make more sense. Put down that the president is limited to 2 full elected terms, meaning that the president can only be elected to 2 full terms. Y'all remember how many maximum years a president can serve? 8. No, it's not 8. It's actually 10. Okay? A vice president can take over halfway through a presidential term if they are sick or assassinated or just simply can't do their job. And then they can actually run for 2 full terms. But if a president takes over like in year 1 or 2 of the previous president's term, they can't run again because you can only serve 10 years. Y'all with me? So the 22nd Amendment set term limits. Up to that point, it was just customary to serve 2 terms. You guys with me? Nothing was in writing saying they had to. FDR, I know some of you's writing your papers on FDR. I've already got a couple of them. He served 4 terms. The reason he done it was because he got us out of the Great Depression. Okay? Everybody loved him. He actually passed away going into his 4th term. So he's the president for the longest of anybody. But they can serve a max of 10 years, but they can only be elected twice. Does everybody understand that? So at the top of that paper, you had the chart where it says formal qualifications for president. We kind of answered a couple of these. How old do you have to be? What's the minimum age? It's 35 years old to run for president. Does anybody know who the youngest president we ever had is? JFK. He was like 36 or 7 when he got elected. The oldest president we ever had is Trump. And if Biden gets elected, I think he's a little bit older. So he would actually get that mantle. So either way, we're going to have the oldest president ever come November. As far as citizenship goes, this one's kind of important. The president has to be a U.S.-born citizen. There's 2 ways to be a citizen. Either be born in the U.S. or to become naturalized. A naturalization is for people from other countries. But you have to be born within the United States to be the president. Okay? So citizenship is you born here. As far as residency goes, you have to have lived in the U.S. for at least 14 years. Now, don't get that confused with being a born citizen. I could have been born in America and moved somewhere else. Does that make sense? As long as I come back and live here for 14 years, I can run for president. Okay? So you have to have lived in the U.S. for at least 14 years. So just to clarify that, you got to be 35 years old, a born citizen. You have to be actually born in the U.S. and have lived in the U.S. for at least 14 years. Then the last part of it, I've already answered number 4 on there for you. You got a maximum term length of 10 years. 2 full terms plus 2 years, so you can only be elected twice. Your annual salary as the president is about $400,000, and your annual expenses is about $50,000. Okay, basically, guys, the president, that money, he don't really need it. I know it don't sound like a lot to run the country, but either they give him a house to live in at the White House, right? He's got planes, fleets of cars, Secret Service protection the rest of his life, free health care, Camp David if he wants a retreat. So he's got multiple fringe benefits when it comes to being the president. Okay? So that was section 1. I know I went through that in a blur. It was actually 10 minutes on the dot. But does anybody have any questions about that? You guys have this already, so that's why I'm not spending a ton of time on it. Y'all with me?
Yeah.
All right. Now, if you will, go to your Google Classroom and open up the section 2 notes they gave you through Cami. That way we can talk about presidential succession. So everybody got that open? All right. So, one back here. So today we're going to talk about what the Constitution explains about presidential succession. We're going to talk about presidential disability, and then basically talk about what the vice president does. Okay? So, very simple, guys. You guys know as well as I do that the president sometimes is not able to fulfill his duties as the commander-in-chief, right? So, we're going to talk about the idea of them, how a vice president would take over if needed, okay? So before we do that, though, there are a couple of definitions at the bottom of this paper. You guys got it open on your computers? Y'all see where I'm at? Number 10 and number 11.
Yes.
Presidential succession and balancing the ticket. We're going to fill those out first. So as far as the definitions go, where it says presidential succession, it says that that's the scheme by which a presidential vacancy is filled. I would shorten it. Just put down how a presidential vacancy is filled. If something were to happen to the president, this is the way that we would fulfill it. Okay? And we'll talk about all that here in a second. Now, there aren't so many ways you can get out of being the president. Any of you know that? Obviously, the president could pass away, right? The president could resign. He could be impeached. Or they could find him unfit for office, which would lead to impeachment, right? So, what if the president gets the flu and just can't do his job? Who would have to take over for a week or so for him to get better? The vice president would, right? Which I'm sure has happened, and they just kind of kept to themselves. You know what I mean? But there is instances where the president simply just can't do his job because he's feeling under the weather, or something comes up. All right. So we're going to talk about the order of succession if something were to hamper what the president's doing, and then talk about a couple other amendments that go with this. So there's a few amendments in Chapter 13 that you're going to have to keep straight. All right. And then number 11, it says balancing the ticket. If you'll notice, you got a big, long definition in the notes up there for balancing the ticket. It says it's the practice of choosing a vice presidential running mate who can strengthen the presidential candidate's chance of being elected. Basically, guys, put down that's when the president chooses a VP candidate to help him win. Okay? It's when the president or the person running for president chooses a VP, which is vice president, to strengthen his chances of winning. Okay? Obviously, candidates for the presidency want to choose someone who would have the ability to help them win an election. Does that make sense? You're not going to want to choose someone that's going to take votes away from you. You're going to want to choose someone that's going to help you gain votes. All right? So balancing the ticket is just simply that. Okay? So far, so simple? Making sense? All right. So, to introduce this, it says, what occurs when the president is unable to perform the duties of the office? If a president dies, resigns, or is removed by impeachment, the vice president succeeds to the presidency. I've not said anything you guys don't already know yet, have I? It's pretty common sense. The president can't fulfill his job, then the vice president takes over, right? It says, if the president is temporarily incapacitated, the vice president becomes acting president until the president can resume office. Now, that's the part you probably didn't know. The president gets sick, maybe, whatever. He needs a couple of days because he's not feeling well. Then the vice president could assume the office if need be. Now, here's what you need to understand. The vice president and Congress have a lot of pull on whether or not they feel the president can do his job. Okay? One of the two job descriptions that happen with the vice president is to tell whether or not the president is capable of being the president. Okay? The other job description he has is being the presiding officer over the Senate, and we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. But being the vice president is a pretty good gig, like being a backup quarterback. Hope nothing happens to the first string guy, right? So, with presidential succession, this is some things that I would like for you to know, but I don't have them on your paper. So if you want to create a text box out to the side, and I'll just tell you what you need to write down because I use some of this as bonus questions. It says the vice president has succeeded the president 9 times in U.S. history. Put that down. The VP has replaced the president 9 times. And the majority of the time it's due to an assassination or an assassination attempt. You guys remember, I don't know if you guys remember this, but when Ronald Reagan was shot, he didn't kill him. You know what I mean? He was shot. He was in the hospital for a while. His vice president dealt with it while he was recovering. So they've replaced the president 9 times. Okay? Now, it says the custom of that the vice president took the presidential office as well. So here's one of these amendments. Tuesday we talked about the 22nd Amendment. That's the term limits for the president. You guys with me? Today we're going to talk about the 25th Amendment. So in that text box, write down the 25th Amendment. And I'm going to explain to you what it means. Okay? What the 25th Amendment does, guys, is make the vice president take the oath of office, meaning he formally becomes the president. They used to not do it this way. That's Lyndon Johnson after JFK was assassinated. All right? He took over once JFK was out of office. They formally introduced him. Okay? So beside the 25th Amendment, put down it's when the vice president formally assumes the office of the president. Okay? They formally assume it. They go through an entire swearing in process, whole night, just like the president did when he was elected. What? Yeah, instead of just saying, here you go, they make a big deal.
If I was vice president, I would kill the president.
I wouldn't. If I was the vice president, he's got the greatest job in the world. He's waiting in line. You know what I'm saying? Like, no, if Trump, well, you hope he don't die. But if nothing happens to the president, he has security, all these great benefits, and all he really has to do is be a tie-breaking vote in the Senate. You know what I mean? By his job description, that's really the only thing he's got to do.
What happens if the vice president
And we're going to talk about that. That's a good question. Okay? So, the 25th Amendment, the VP formally assumes office. All right? Now, I don't know if this will let me blow this part up. No, it never does. But we're back at the top of your paper. You guys see 1 through 5 there, which is the order of succession to the presidency. I'm going to ask you to know the first 5. First year I taught this, I made everybody name 18 of them in a row, and that was miserable. Live and learn. So you got to know the first 5, okay? So go ahead in your notes, write down, obviously the first one's the vice president. If something were to happen to the president, then the VP would take over. But then go 2, 3, 4, 5, because those are the ones you've probably not really ever heard of, okay? So you have the Speaker of the House. The third one is called the President Pro Tempore. The third one is the Secretary of State, and then the 5th one is the Secretary of the Treasury. It is. And jot those down, and then we're going to talk a little bit about this succession. Has everybody got this jotted down? Okay, now as you guys are finishing that part up, I'm just going to kind of start talking about it. If you'll look down that list, you know, you got the Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury. The 6th one is Secretary of Defense, which makes a lot of sense. You know, you'd have somebody with military background if it ever got to that point. The Attorney General. And then you have the Secretary of the Interior as the 8th person. Number 9, Secretary of Agriculture. Now, I'm not knocking those job descriptions, but if you look all the way down at the bottom, number 18, it says Secretary of Homeland Security. Would you guys feel more comfortable with the Secretary of Homeland Security taking over than you would with the Secretary of Agriculture? I would. You know what I mean? Not because not that person probably couldn't do it. It's just the job titles kind of insinuate maybe a little bit different background, experience-wise, right? So, my question to you is, how or why would the Constitution label the Secretary of Agriculture 9 spots ahead of the Secretary of Homeland Security? Why would they put the Secretary of Transportation ahead of the Secretary of Veteran Affairs? You know, why? What is the deal with that? Do any of you know? You'll take a stab at it, Sid? You like to take it?
I mean, they're probably going to get to that point.
Right, you're right. We're never going to get to that point. This is the cabinet that the president has. This is the 18 cabinet members. These are the heads of the different types of the executive branch cabinets. Y'all with me? If they ever have a meeting, they purposely leave somebody out of it for the sole objective. If something were to happen during that meeting and 17 of these individuals didn't make it, we have somebody to succeed the president. Granted, that'll never happen. Hopefully it'll never happen. You guys ever watch that TV show? What's the name of that TV show? Where the dude, he was the sole survivor, lone survivor, what is it? Where they blow up the White House. And this guy that's like the Secretary of Labor was the one not at the White House, but now he's the acting president because everybody else they can't find or whatever. But anyway, the reason they do that, guys, if you start at number 4 and work your way down, those cabinet spaces are the ones that are the oldest to the youngest. You guys with me? George Washington had a Secretary of the State and a Secretary of the Treasury. That was the only 2 he had. And as time evolved, these other ones started getting added. You guys with me? So, the reasons the Secretary of Homeland Security is at the bottom of this list is because it's the newest cabinet. Y'all got it? So they basically go in how old they are. Okay? So that's how that works. Speaker of the House, does anybody in here know who the Speaker of the House is? Y'all got to be kidding me.
Nancy.
You have Nancy Pelosi, right? Does anybody know what I'm even referring to as the President pro tempore? Any of you ever heard that before? No? All right. Let's look at it like this. Congress has how many houses in it? 2, right? 2. Beside the Vice President on your paper, put down Leader of the Senate. This will all make sense in a second. Just jot down Leader of the Senate. Okay? The Speaker of the House, which is Nancy Pelosi, put down that they are the Leader of the House of Representatives. She's like the chair or whatever. You guys understand that? Now,
Who's leader of the Senate?
the Vice President. Okay? Now, there's a catch to that. Okay? He is the presiding officer in the Senate. Now, do you think he sits in the Senate all the time? He's there all the time doing whatever? No. Basically, he's the tiebreaker vote, guys. If for whatever reason the Senate can tie, and by the way, how many senators are there per state? 2, right? Grand total of 100. So is it possible to have a tie in a voting situation? Yes. If there were, he would be the one that broke the tie. Okay? That's basically his, as far as he goes in the Senate. Speaker of the House, you have Nancy Pelosi. She's in charge of kind of the direction the Speaker of the House works. President pro tempore is the leader of the Senate when the VP's not there. You guys with me? Do any of you know who the President pro tempore is right now? His name's Chuck Grassley. I don't care if you remember that name. You may hear it on a bonus question. Okay? But he's the one that kind of directs the Senate and what they're going to be doing on a day-to-day basis because the Vice President just simply don't. Okay? He could, but he don't. All right? Secretary of State then follows in line. Then you have the Secretary of the Treasury. All right? So that's how that kind of goes. Okay? Again, I'll need you to know those first 5 when we have test or quiz. Is everybody with me thus far? Does this make sense?
Yeah.
All right. If you look at number 6, it says, how does the Constitution provide for the situation in which the president is disabled? So that's where we're going to have to spend a little bit of time today. Okay? Talk a little bit about presidential disability. I'm going to read you the notes, and then we're going to kind of answer it as we go through it. It says, for many years, there were no provisions for deciding if a president was too disabled to continue in office. Now, most of these guys, presidential people, are tough-minded figures. Does that make sense? Mentally tough. The common cold, they're going to show up to work. If they got the flu, they may show up to work. Some of them literally had strokes and tried to show up for work. Okay? But as far as in the Constitution, there was nothing written about, well, if the president has a stroke or maybe has a heart attack, what do we do? Like, how does this work? Like, who goes in? How do we replace him? Things of that nature. So, there was no provisions for it. Then he gives you a couple of examples. Woodrow Wilson had a stroke in 1919, and he's too ill to meet for his cabinet for 7 months. What's hard? You don't have Zoom meetings in 1919. They're not just going to go sit in a hospital room and say, hey, let's figure this out. So he was just unable to do it. Eisenhower had 3 illnesses while he was in office that left him where he couldn't deal with things. And then Reagan was obviously shot, tried to be killed, and he was laid up in the hospital for a while. So what is it that we did in order to address this? Now, we've already written down the 25th Amendment, right? Then y'all put that in a little text box over there to the side. And all we put down in it so far was that how the Vice President formally took over office, correct? So we're going to add to this, okay? So the 25th Amendment is the disability issue, and you write disability issue beside of it, okay? We're actually going to write this twice. We're going to add it up there, and then we'll add it number 6, okay? So either, or you can do it once. I like to write it down twice because I like to keep them separated. But anyway, the 25th Amendment gives you the disability issue. It says the Vice President becomes acting President if. So underneath the 25th Amendment, write down a 1. We're going to put something beside it. Then we're going to write down a number 2 and write down something beside it. There's 2 options to figure out whether or not the President is capable of doing his job. Y'all with me thus far? Okay. So, the Vice President becomes acting President if, number 1, the President informs Congress. So basically, the President tells Congress that he or she cannot carry out the powers. So literally, the President, in writing, writes a letter to Congress and says, I cannot do my job. Then the Vice President will take over. Y'all with me? Trying to keep this simple. Now, the number of times that that's probably happened, I don't know. And again, we're answering number 6 along with your text box, okay? So it says, how does the Constitution provide for situations in which the President is disabled? 25th Amendment. Number 1, the President tells Congress he can't do it. Now, if the President does that, do you think it's on a long-term or temporary basis? Probably temporary. He's sick. He's got some things going on health-wise. Whatever the situation may be. He's informing Congress, I can't do this. Let the Vice President temporarily do it. Y'all got it? Now, number 2, and the more significant one, says the Vice President and the Cabinet informs Congress that the President cannot do his job. Now, if the Vice President and Congress agree that the President cannot fulfill his duties, do you think that's for a temporary basis or for a longer term? That's probably for a longer term. He's doing something he probably shouldn't be doing, or he's doing some things that's violating the Constitution, which would probably lead to impeachment anyway. So basically, regardless of the situation, who gets to make the decision on whether or not the President can do his job? Congress, right? It just depends on how they get the information, whether it be through the President or through the Vice President and his Cabinet. So that's the 25th Amendment. Those are the disability issues, whether or not the President can do his job. I will ask you that again, okay? So make sure you got them in your brain, okay? Number 7, it says, what duties are given to the Vice President by the Constitution? Well, that's, like I said, this would be the greatest job ever. It's like being a bullpen catcher in the majors.
Making
You
$500,000.
make a lot of money, you don't really, all you got to do is catch a ball. Throw it back. Don't hit nobody in the shin. You know what I mean? So, what does the Constitution say that the Vice President has to do? Okay, if you'll notice, and I'll scroll too far. It says the Constitution gives the Vice President 2 formal duties. So again, write down number 1. In number 7, we're going to put down 2 answers. So the 2 things that the Constitution says the Vice President has to do. Number 1, put down that they preside over the Senate. And I've already kind of alluded to that earlier. They are over the Senate. Now, they're not in there every day. They don't have to be in there every day. They don't want to be in there every day. He's simply the tie-breaking vote. The last time he had to be a tie-breaking vote was when the Secretary of Education was appointed by Donald Trump. What's her name, Coach? Betty DeVos? DeVos.
She's an idiot.
She was 50-50 split in Congress on whether or not she should be appointed. Does that make sense? 50 said no, 50 said yes. So Pence came in and he voted yes. Very simple reason why. The President was the one that appointed her, right? So obviously Trump wanted her in office. So it was an easy decision for Pence. He's going to go the same way that the President went, right? So that's how she got her appointment, okay? So the first thing is he's the presiding officer in the Senate, okay? But then the second one we've already talked about. Put down that he helps decide if the President is disabled. Helps decide if the President is disabled. Everybody with me on the 2 job descriptions he has? Makes sense? Simple. All right. Number 8 says, how are vice presidents usually selected? Guys, that's pretty self-explanatory. How do we get vice presidents? They are what? They're not elected. I mean, they are elected. But as far as getting to be the vice president, do you have to go through an election to win the nomination to be the vice president? No. How do you do it?
Because how
The president picks them, okay? So simply beside the number 8, put down there chosen to balance the ticket. And if you guys remember, we wrote the definition of that down at the bottom. It's when you choose a running mate that'll help strengthen your chances of winning an election. So they're chosen by balancing the ticket. And then number 9, Sid, you asked me this a little bit earlier. The question asks you, it says, how can a vacancy in the vice presidency be filled? So I just went through and gave you this long list of people that would take over if something were to happen to the president, right? All right, well, let's say that the vice president has to take over. Something actually happens to the president. He's no longer able to do it. So now the vice president is the president. Y'all got me? I know that can be confusing. Does everybody just move up one step at that point? If the vice president becomes president, does the Speaker of the House become second in charge? President pro tempore, or excuse me, Speaker of the House become first, President pro tempore becomes second, and so forth? Do we just move up? No, we don't. The vice president gets to choose a vice president. Y'all got me? The vice president that now just became president, he gets to nominate his own VP. You guys understand that? And Congress has to affirm it. Basically, the majority vote in the Senate and House of Representatives says, yeah, that's fine. This guy will work. You guys understand that? So in number 9, put down that the president, which was the old VP, nominates a new vice president. So I hope that makes sense. I hope you guys understand what I'm trying to say there.
Vice president, term president, his vice president.
Yeah, he gets to choose it, and then then Congress has to approve it by majority vote. Okay. Excuse me. Now, does anybody have any questions as far as those notes go? I hope it's pretty self-explanatory. Does it make sense?
If I really wanted to be the vice president, would I actually have to have any kind of qualifications?
There are qualifications to being the president.
I'm
Excuse me, the vice president. Yes, there are.
Because I mean, if the
Well, if you think about it, you probably have to be at least 35 because you could assume the role of the presidency, right? You've probably got to be at least 35. You have to be a naturally born citizen, meaning you're born in the U.S.
I mean, like, do I need to have a degree or anything?
No, there's nothing specific.
So, like, if I just became friends with the president,
Well, I think it's based more on friends than more than just friends. You know what I
I
mean?
mean, if they like me a lot,
That would help. I mean, he's not going to.
so, like, they can have no experience or degree or anything.
Right.
Just
I would know. I don't think there's anything written saying they have to. All right.
that's- Please stop sending things that I can change.
All right. Does anybody else have any questions? All right. I'm going to upload a little 10-question quiz in the classwork tab of your classroom. Thank you. And we're going to work on it during the last 20 or 30 minutes of class right here. And you can just resubmit it to me once you finish it. Okay? Hopefully, since you just heard the notes on it, that it'll make sense. Y'all with me? So let me just add it, and we will stop right there for today.